Welcome to the CRO Talks podcast, the companion podcast for the CRO Roundtable, a bite-sized chunk of content summarizing a recent roundtable discussion topic. So you might have noticed, we are slightly rebranding a little bit. We're putting everything all under one cohesive banner instead of having a separate name for the roundtable and the podcast and the LinkedIn posts on pages and all that good stuff. So everything's all going to now be together at CROTalks.com. That's going to be our base of operations for everything. Now, today, we took a little bit of a hiatus to do the rebranding and had some work stuff going on, all good things like that, but we're getting back into it. So today, let's talk about trust and authenticity in case studies. This is a really good topic that we've had quite a bit of discussion around at multiple multiple roundtables and in dialogues with friends and colleagues and LinkedIn chats and whatnot. I think originally it all kicked off because I personally wanted to get better at publishing case studies myself for marketing purposes, really, to show like, hey, I know how to run split tests and actually, do a good job of them. And you see lots of people posting similar kinds of content like, hey, we ran a split test and, we got a 150% improvement on some sort of metric. And immediately, like, an experienced practitioner who's honest and diligent, any kind of big number like that is going to raise red flags right off the bat.
It's probably worth at this point explaining what do we mean by a case study? What is a case study? Because I think from my perspective, a case study is when somebody shares an experiment result. Hey, we did this button text test, and we saw this improvement, and that in itself is a case study. So I think that's what we mean by case study, right? Or is there something else that you would include in that?
Yeah, the core kernel of a case study, at least within context of doing CRO work, would be publicly publishing the results of an experiment that you ran or research that you did, where you're including like statistics that went into it, and hopefully also like your analysis of those statistics and your like recommendations of like, okay, what did you do as a consequence, right? That's the bare bones of it. Yeah. Now, within that, what kind of information do you think should be included in a case study on a baseline level? Like, let's establish, here's the core components of what you should be publishing for a case study.
So I think it really depends on why you are publishing the case study in the first place. So, for instance, an example case study is, hey, we ran this test, we got 60 billion% increase in sales. And this meant that everybody's rich, everybody's kind of now retired. We've now retired, we've gone to the Bahamas. See you, folks. That's that sort of message. So I guess what a case study like that is trying to demonstrate is competency. So, or like if
I would counter a case study like that is not just competency, but trying to demonstrate exceptionalism. Like, look at the amazing results that we can get.
True.
Yes. There's an implication there of like, we can do this versus other people that are doing this type. Like, here's why you should pick us to be your agency of record.
This could be you.
Or
this win could be your win, sort
right.
of thing. So with that in mind, like if this was what you were trying to communicate, then I think the base level would be, what did you test? What was the actual UI that you tested? What was the research that went into it, and what were the results? Now, in terms of like taking a step back from this, I actually don't like publishing case studies at all. for this specific reason, that it seems to be like you're trying to communicate exceptionalism rather than competency. And I think there's other more valuable ways to do that. And I think it feeds into the other type of case study that people post, which I think is really misleading and leads us to some dark areas of CRO, which is like, hey, we tested this, which means in effect, you should test this as well on your
Or
site.
even worse, like we tested this so you don't have to.
Yeah, exactly. So just roll it out or whatever. And that kind of like best practice kind of conversation, this kind of
Yeah.
like
That's a
good
whole other
UI,
topic in itself.
yeah, as a whole
Yeah.
topic in itself, but that's something that a case study leads itself into. So I'm going to be really honest off the bat. I'm not a fan of those types of case studies where you're trying to prove exceptionalism or you're talking about a specific experiment. So in terms of like your question, what should be included as a baseline? To me, it doesn't matter. But I'd be interested to hear like
Okay.
what you because you actually were on
Yeah,
the
because I put a
side of publishing case
yeah, I
studies,
put a
right?
decent bit of work into this and thinking about okay, what because you don't want to publish too much, but you also don't want to publish too little. Like it's a case study, so it's by the intent is for it to be consumed. So if you're writing a 20-page paper, the how many people are going to actually be inclined to read that given the context of what you're trying to accomplish with that, right? Like you're posting it publicly, so
Mm.
like a 20-page paper would make more sense if it's an internal, right, and analysis document or something like that, right? So case study, you have to balance quality and brevity there. So at least as a baseline, I think, to be honest, if you're reporting test results, well, you have to report the the first the improvement level. So what was the change that was observed? The statistical confidence level of that. Um, report the sample size of users placed into each variation, but then also the sample size of the uh, conversion met for the goal as well. So if you're tracking, order conversion rate and you have, 1,000 people in one variation and 50 of them placed an order, like you need to report both of those numbers for each
So
of the variations.
would you say then what you're really doing or what you're really saying as a case study is you want to just publish a scorecard? Is that an accurate?
No, that's just a starting point. So like that's from a number standpoint, that's you should be reporting that stuff so that people can look at it, and like reporting those numbers dissuades fears of either dishonesty or incompetence. Like the
Right.
the classic example is reporting the large uplift, but then when you ask for absolute values, you find that like someone's reporting 100% uplift, and it was like from 5 to 10 on us, whereas like getting 5 additional conversions of that goal is an absolute meaningless number because it's a drop in the bucket because they get thousands of those conversions on a daily basis for a site.
But then what's the difference between that and a scorecard then? Because
Well,
for me, a
no,
scorecard would have all of that.
scorecard would be a component of the case study.
Okay, so you're talking about a much more in-depth case study where
Yeah,
you are actually wanting to provide more information, like a scorecard. People would have that context
right,
within the
right.
company. They have the internal context of where this experiment sits. But with a case
Yeah.
study, what you're trying to do is trying to paint the entire picture that led to or
Yeah.
surrounding
Like
this
here's
experiment.
what actually happened so you can validate things for yourself. So you're proffering that as a gesture of trust to say like here's what actually happened, or if you have to comply with like privacy laws or something like that, like you could slightly alter the numbers in some way or something, or if you're not allowed to publish them for privacy reasons, then hey, don't publish the case study. Like you know, like it's real. Like the skeptic in me, if I'm reading a case study and you have like okay, so you have the scorecard, that I'm talking about, and then but then the next section is going to be the analysis. Like, okay, what's the interpretation of that data? Like, what caused that change to happen? And then you're describing, like, describe the variations that you tested. So scorecard test parameters of, like, here's what you actually tested. Research, like, here's what went into coming up with the idea for the tests to begin with. And then, right, scorecard, analysis, and then interpretation, like, and recommendation of, like, okay, here's what we did as a result of that.
So,
And if you're omitting any of those sections, that degrades, at least for me, like, my level of trust in reading that case study. Like,
so when it comes to like, so here's a question for you then. And we haven't had this discussion before,
mhm,
since we had the last discussion about case studies when we were actually
mhm.
delving into how do you actually approach this? What did you want to communicate with your case studies, and what did it actually work in terms of like the goal, the reason why you wanted to write these case studies? I take it to attract new clients and stuff for the place that you're working at. Did it actually work? But specifically, going back to the original question, what were you trying to communicate with that case study?
Yeah, my intent with publishing them was to show competence of, like, we ran we run tests in this fashion, so, like, we're the real deal. Like, hey, here's the entire context of, like, A to Z, everything that we did for this test.
But when you say
Summarized.
competence, do you mean competence in terms of like the specifically detailing the process, or specifically detailing the competence of you achieving specific goals for a company?
um the former.
Yeah, okay. So the kind of delving into the process, trying to
Yeah.
trying to show
To show,
this
like,
is this
we
is our
know what
process.
we're doing. Yes.
Right.
And also, my intent, and with several of the studies that we did publish, was not every test result was a winning improvement that was implemented
Okay, it's interesting.
as well.
Yeah.
Like, we published inconclusive results, results that were saves versus wins, to show the gamut, right? Because I think that's also an issue that I have with seeing case studies published online, is most people only publish the good result because they're trying to attract customers
Yeah.
with
But
it.
I think what you
Like,
said
I
there
was
is,
treating that attraction as a side effect of, like, that may happen, but it's not like, it's a secondary effect. It's not the primary purpose.
yeah.
One thing I also wanted to do was, in publishing those, create dialogue and conversation around this facet itself. Like, if I publish something and someone sees that they think something's off about that report, I wanted them to, like, be able and have the freedom to, like, ask that question in a post. Be like, hey, there, what about this on this result or whatever? Like, did you consider that? And create that dialogue so that I could also get better myself as well.
Mm, yeah. That's interesting. So basically, it's more than just about detailing competency, but actually engaging in deeper levels of conversation about the approach, process,
Hmm.
whatever it is around the experiment. That whole
Yeah.
thing about the detailing the process,
Education.
yeah, education
Yeah.
piece. That whole thing about detailing the process, I think that is quite kind of interesting because that's how I would. I mean, when I say that I don't like case studies, I don't like those types of case studies which just show, hey, this is a type of win that you could get
Yeah.
and stuff like that. But a case study that actually highlights a process and what the results of a process were, or a case study that highlights something unique and interesting that happened as part of the process. I think those are kind of case studies that I am kind of I do kind of like. So it's interesting that you did that you said you going into like wanting to communicate the process, the experiment process that you guys do. So that leads me to the other question then. Did it work? Did it actually generate leads for you? Just that whole uh,
Problem was we ended up not doing it enough. I
right,
wanted to really get up to like a weekly cadence, and it just never really got there.
right.
Yeah. So that was a different problem. There's also the issue, and this is more of like a social media issue, or just in like marketing and promotions in general. Like, it's not just if you post it, they will come kind of thing, right? Like
Yeah.
you have to pull on strings and things like that to encourage conversation and stuff. So
Because I think, yeah. By the time somebody's looking at a case study, I mean, there's various kind of like things. If you think of it from a user's perspective, they're either looking at a case study because hey, this is interesting, or they're looking at a case study because we're looking to hire an agency. Let's see what kind of process these guys are doing. Can we check that these guys know what they're doing?
yeah, it
Uh,
was also that of like building up a backlog for if when
yeah,
someone comes to look at you, they can see, oh, okay, they know what they're talking about.
yeah,
That was
yeah,
also that was yes, that was a good reminder. Like, yeah,
yeah,
that was an aspect of it as well. Yeah.
yeah. I think
No,
when
no.
we talk,
Secretly, my goal was to publish a case study that you personally would actually like. Like, I did it all just like I'll finally write a case study that Iqbal will approve, and then I'll be happy.
I actually, I think I did see a case study where I liked, like I say, the case studies that actually communicate something that's quite kind of different, unique, or that's not really outwardly salesy. That's kind of much more geared towards, well, we tried this process and this is what happened. So I'm less interested in what UI tweaks somebody has done and what was the result of that, because I I I do find that whole kind of focus on, hey, what ideas can we test? Like if you're thinking about, if you're in the process of thinking about, hey, what ideas can we test? Let's go hunt around LinkedIn to find what stuff people have done so we can test it on our site. Is such a it, it's such a wrong-headed way of approaching experimentation. Like, because I like to approach things from a problem-centric perspective of
Right.
let's see what the problems are on our site and then ideate from there. And then ideation is just something that happens. So I'm more interested in case studies that are about like, yeah, we tried
The
this
research
approach
component
slightly.
at the start of like identifying a problem that is specific to you, and then thinking about that ways to solve that problem, right?
Yeah,
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 problem based research rather than solution based testing, which
yeah.
is right a very common thing, right? You see lots of, and that could be a whole other topic
Yeah.
for us to get
I
into
or
too.
rather like the solution I'd be interested in if there was like a unique way of approaching of getting to the solution. Like we decided to test this because we found this and this and this and blah blah blah, and then this is a solution that we decided to test as a result. And then in that case, I'm that's a case study that gets the thumb up. I think there should be fireworks. Yeah, there we go.
That is something that we discovered by accident a couple of weeks ago when we were on a meeting, and
Yeah,
now Iqbal can't not use it every time.
every time.
There's like hand gestures that you can do that a Mac camera will automatically like embed emoji particle effects into the
Yeah.
video stream.
So
So
I've got a huge advantage over you,
yeah,
I think.
yeah. There's been
Yeah.
a ridiculous proliferation of double thumbs ups from you since discovering that.
Yeah, that's actually bled into my real life as well with my family and stuff. It's like, hey, where are the fireworks? Where are the fireworks? So yeah.
Yeah,
Cool.
but
So, was there anything else about like I think it was worth mentioning that we had this discussion about case studies with Shiva in a roundtable, and we were talking about, and I think this is, and this leads, this kind of goes back to your question about what information should be included in a case study, because what he was sort of saying is should we inherently trust that somebody knows what they're doing if they're presenting a case study? Should there be an implicit level of trust? And also, when somebody does share a case study, there's like a good way of interacting with somebody, and there's a bad way of interacting with somebody. Like from my perspective, I just don't interact whatsoever.
yeah, yeah. There's a line there of like, well, what approach do you want to take? Do you want to have a positive interaction or a negative interaction?
Yeah.
So, and my take is I'm generally a trusting person. Like I'm going to believe that someone did that work and they honestly like they're not trying to deliberately misinterpret or misrepresent or something like that. Now there's still a difference between like trusting someone and verifying their level of competence or diligence, right? Like you can look at a case study and someone that's more experienced, if you see a red flag immediately, like there's something like, okay, this person missed XYZ thing. Like I know you're digging through tests because you're a judge for the is it the Experimentation Elite Awards,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So you've been doing a ton of this
Yeah.
recently, and one of the really quick, and you've told me this, one of the really easy things that you look at right off the bat is SRM checks. So that's like a real obvious, like you look at someone's test results, and if they're, well, if they haven't provided you with sample size data, right, that's a problem. Now
Yeah.
that doesn't mean you shouldn't trust that person. That just means they may be inexperienced of
Yeah.
like not knowing that, oh, hey, we should report this part as well because it shows like we did things
Yeah.
correctly, you know? And then if you report it, okay, then you're on the next level. But then did you do an SRM check to see like was the, traffic distributed evenly within the design parameters and all that stuff, right? So same reason that you would publish that data. It's showing that you know what you're doing and you like have can interpret things validly and whatnot. Now, say you're reading someone's report and you see that issue. Well, are you coming at that with the intent to discipline or educate?
Yeah.
Meaning, and the negative interaction versus the positive interaction. Like, you didn't do an SRM check. You suck at running tests. Like, you should get out of this industry. What are you talking? Like, no, don't do that. Like, that's the
Yeah.
negative reinforcement. Like gatekeeping. Like, no, there's no place for that kind of thing. You can still point that out in a constructive manner, though.
Yeah, but it's a difficult way to like if you're doing it publicly, just pointing that out, especially when they're if their intention is to, hey, I'm wanting to display competency and exceptionalism here to attract people to me, to hire me to do their
Mhm.
experimentation. If somebody, even in a constructive way, kind of like I don't think there is a constructive way for you to approach that person publicly and to kind of say, well,
Mm-hmm.
you got SRM, because anyway, it's kind of like because of their intention, it's kind of,
Well, that's still, I don't know. Like, it's on them, I think, to have a little bit like how do they react to that interpretation?
yeah,
Like, oh, what do you talk? Like, do they scrub it and try and hide and obfuscate it? Well, then it's okay. Then they're right. Then they're degrading their perceived trust. Like 'cause you initially trusted them, but then right, they're taking steps to be deceptive
yeah,
versus
yeah,
you know hey, I noticed like this might have an SRM check. Did you do this? And then if their response is, oh no, I didn't do it, but I didn't know to do that. Like right, like have a mea culpa, like it's a learning experience, right?
Mm,
It
mm.
goes back to the same, like I was saying, this is why I wanted to publish. One of the reasons I wanted to publish case studies is like, hey, I kind of want to see if people can poke holes in my stuff. Like
But
I want,
again, this is the different levels of intention, right?
yeah,
Because
yeah,
if
yeah, yeah,
your intention is to put something out to learn versus the intention of somebody else to prove exceptionalism in their line of work, then in that case, for them to say like, hey, this is a moment where I can kind of reflect and say, this is a learning experience for me on something as basic as SRM would not be something that they'd be open to, and be something that it would be quite a kind of breaking moment for them to
right,
say like, hey, I posted this thing, I was hoping to get loads of people to think of me as exceptional, and now everybody thinks that I don't know what I'm doing. It's kind of backfired because I'm trying to put myself forward as a thought leader or whatever, but
yeah,
I've proven that I'm not at that level yet. So yeah, there's different levels of intention. I think from my perspective, I think there's probably a way to like you say, approach it, and I think the way to approach it is to probably approach them in as a DM to say, hey, you got SRM in your test, and then just leave it at that, but
see how
not
they react
necessarily
to
make it.
like, yeah, you uh, praise publicly, refute privately.
Yes, that's a kind of like a rule that I guess I kind of live by
Mm-hmm.
when it
Mm-hmm.
comes to yeah.
Yeah, that's tricky though, because it's the same thing around like, well, they probably just don't care anyway. So you know, but
Yeah.
hey, leave it. Like if you don't get any negative feedback, keep keep on keeping on, I suppose.
Yeah. But again, it's kind of like it's a two-way thing, right?
Hmm.
It's their it's them and their brand and what you're doing to their brand, but also the way you communicate with them is your brand. So then you
Yeah,
need to be on brand. Like if you're going to be going out there and kind of like dunking on other people's yum, or what is it? Yucking on people's yum. Um,
that's a new one. I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, don't
I've
yuck on you don't yuck on someone else's yum. Uh,
I've
so
never heard that one
basic,
before.
you not heard that one. So if somebody
Either
said,
I'm too old or I'm on the wrong continent.
yeah, if somebody's eating like or bubblegum ice cream, and they kind of go, yum, bubblegum ice cream, you don't go and say, yuck, bubblegum ice cream. That's disgusting. You just kind of accept that they like it, and you kind of go, yeah, you like bubblegum ice cream. It's not my
And then
thing, but you like it, so.
I would say that that's a little bit of a strained analogy because that's personal preference
Oh,
versus yeah,
there was no analogy there to
yeah.
experimentation
Okay,
by.
okay,
It's just telling you what the yuck on
okay.
somebody's yum
I see.
means.
Okay, yeah, yeah. One other aspect that we haven't really covered that I know you're particularly passionate about is going into like the narrative goal.
Yes.
Like and we've sort of discussed that of like what's the goal of like why you're publishing the case study, but like the narrative meaning like the context and the story of the test itself and how that is communicated.
Yeah, so that was something that we discussed in the last chat, and it was basically if we look at in terms of genre, story genre, and the communication genre, you can convey something in an informational way, i.e., you're just giving them the data, the information for them to work out for themselves, or you could be approaching it from a propaganda way in terms of like, I want to communicate why you should be testing, so this is the reason why I'm communicating this. In which case, and propaganda gets a bad word, but actually, it's
It just is
all
what it is.
it is what it is. It's basically a message that you're trying to persuade somebody.
Right,
So
right. Yeah,
that
there's publishing to inform versus publishing to convince.
Yes, exactly. Like trying to convince somebody that that you know what you're doing, and it's exceptionalism and stuff like that. That is a propaganda. That is something that is going to be laced within that narrative of that case study. It's going to flavor that case study in that direction, where basically you're going to be presenting stuff that highlights your best qualities and stuff like that. So that's just the way it is. But then there's other ways as well of communicating. Like if you're just communicating a how-to guide or something like that, or if you're just wanting to educate, then that's something else to do with case studies. So that's something that you mentioned there. So depending on what
And these aren't binary things either. It's a complete spectrum. Like you can be doing both at the same time as well,
yes,
right?
but
There's not one. It's not like pure one way or the other.
I would argue that for certain things it is. Like if you say you can't approach something and say that you're approaching something from an informational perspective, like, hey, I'm just giving you the information here, but then you lace it with some propaganda, with some stuff to
Right.
say, so that then those two things cannot coexist together. Informational while educating, those two things could probably blend, but certain things would probably like for instance, with when if you're trying to communicate something specifically, then it may not blend nicely with something that's much more documentary style, information heavy,
Mhm.
and you just getting the user to make up their mind. Um, so yeah, I think
Yeah,
it does kind of.
and I've thought of maybe like a succinct example of that when you're publishing a test result and in the like results and analysis section, the the difference between saying here's what we did as a consequence of this data versus here's what you should do as a consequence of the data, right?
Mm,
Like providing external direction versus internal action, right?
mm.
Like once you're trying to convince someone else outside of your organization to do something, that's when it starts to become propaganda.
Yeah, and there's different that inspire is different from propaganda. So that's the other kind of like the type of communication you could narrative goal you could have. It could be something that you're trying to inspire. So that would be different to like maybe you're trying to inspire somebody to think in a certain way or to inspire them to test themselves, but you're not specifically lacing it with an underlying message or something. Again, when we're talking about propaganda, we're not talking about it in any sort of like negative way. It's just it is what it is when you're trying when you tell a story and laced within that story is a kind of something a different way that you want people to behave and a very specific way that you want people to behave, then that is propaganda. Steven Spielberg does propaganda because he kind of manipulates emotions and stuff like that. So you could argue that that is a form of propaganda. So it's not necessarily labeling things in a bad way, but yeah, just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, the the language and the phrasing that you use affects the interpretation.
Yeah,
Like you could have two different case studies that state the exact same thing, but one is written very dry and clinically in an analytical manner and is laced with like scientific sounding words and stuff versus the other one that's like very loose, informal, maybe somewhat self-deprecating or something like that.
yeah,
And it's the exact same case study with the same data and everything, but they're interpreted very differently.
yeah,
Yeah, or
exactly.
or differing levels of scrutiny are applied to each. Like if you're presenting something as like scientific, buttoned up, someone's probably going to take a closer magnifying glass to look at that and potentially try and pull it apart versus like if you're being jovial and informal and friendly.
Yeah, if you're writing a post to inspire, then it is the detail may not be as important as
Hmm.
if you're writing to inform. And if you're writing to inform, we're talking about white papers, scientific papers, or something like that. In which case, there would be a level of scrutiny there that maybe when you're writing something just to inspire, motivate people to experiment. It's not necessarily there. At the same time, if you're doing propaganda and you're misleading, like if you're trying to show exceptionalism, but you're misleading with the way that you're approaching it, then that's also kind of breaking the rules a little bit, or kind of inviting people
Hmm.
to come back to you and kind of like push back.
Yeah,
So
like the I guess it's somewhat cliche example of like, oh, I helped a client make $1 million extra a year or something.
yeah,
Well, what's the what's the context of that though? You
yeah,
know,
yeah,
like, oh, well, were you working at a Fortune 100 company where, your series of tests maybe did help do $1 million?
yeah,
Um, but that's like a fraction of a percent lift. And if you applied those same percentages to, a mid-market e-commerce, it'd be like $1,000 a year. And it's like, okay, well, who cares? Like that's
yeah,
a drop in the bucket. That's, that doesn't even cover, my monthly tool cost expenses.
yeah, exactly.
So, all right. Well, good conversation as always. If anyone has any questions, feedback, or if you disagree with something that we said, you can always talk to me and Iqbal face to face at the CRO Roundtable every Friday. Details are on our LinkedIn page and at crotalks.com. If you're shy or you don't like speaking, you can always try and connect with us directly on LinkedIn instead. Thanks for listening, and we will catch you next time.